Good morning, everybody. It is still morning. A beautiful morning it is here in Louisville, Kentucky. I'd like to welcome you to our session on Louisville independent and underground music of the late 20th century. And to welcome everybody here this morning in the room with us, and to welcome people watching, streaming online. We're going to open up this morning. I'll talk a little bit about the lovely people to my right here, and then we'll have a conversation about the Louisville scene for, I'm guessing, about an hour, and then the last 30 minutes we'll leave things open to the audience and have a conversation sort of in the round. So I'll just start by introducing the people on the panel this morning, and I'll do it alphabetically. First is Ethan Buckler, and Ethan has spent most of his years with Louisville-based band King Kong. After releasing 6 albums and a few singles over 25 years, mostly on the Chicago-based label Drag City, he and King Kong, with help from others, have lately embarked on creating YouTube music videos. Ethan was also an early member of Slint. Stephen Driesler is co-curator of the current exhibition White Glove Test, Louisville Punk Flyers 1978-1994, and anyone who was lucky enough to be with us the other night at the Kentucky Museum of Art and Craft knows what an amazing exhibition that is. Stephen is also the co-author of the book of the same name, White Glove Test, soon to be published also by Drag City. Heather Fox is an assistant professor in the Archives and Special Collections Library at the University of Louisville. She is one of 4 archivists at U of L spearheading the recently launched Louisville Underground Music Archive, or LUMA, project, which aims to address the gap in the historical record related to independent and underground rock music culture in Louisville. The LUMA team's article, Saving All the Freaks on the Life Raft, best title ever, blending documentation strategy with community engagement to build a local music archive, will be published in the spring 2015 issue of American Archivist. Heather has had the pleasure of playing rhythm guitar in the local garage band Juanita for 23 years. They've released 145 RPM on orange vinyl featuring monster songs on both sides. I suppose that's not songs about monsters, it's actually songs that are themselves monsters.
No, they're about monsters.
Okay.
He says both.
Okay. Rachel Grimes is a pianist, composer, and arranger based in Kentucky. She's toured the US, Europe, and Asia as a solo pianist and also as a collaborator with chamber ensembles such as Amsterdam Sinfonietta, Trio, and Orchestra Kandinsky. Rachel's performed at a number of music festivals, including All Tomorrow's Parties, P Festival in Taiwan, Crosslinks in the Netherlands, and Big Ears in Knoxville. Her solo recordings include The Clearing, Book of Leaves, Marion County 1938, and Compound Leaves. In addition to her band Hula Hoop in the 1990s, Rachel was a founding member of the groundbreaking indie rock chamber ensemble Rachel's, with whom she toured and released 6 albums on the Chicago-based label Quarterstick Touch and Go. David Grubbs is Associate Professor of Music at the CUNY Grad Center and Brooklyn College, where he also teaches in the MFA programs in Performance and Interactive Media Arts and Creative Writing. He is the author of Records Ruin the Landscape, John Cage, the 60s and Sound Recording, which came out last year from Duke. David was a founding member of the bands Squirrelbait, Bastro, and Gastro del Sol, has released 12 solo albums, and has recently collaborated with poet Susan Howe, visual artist Anthony McCall, and Angela Bullock, and choreographer Jonah Beaucaire. Britt Walford was born in Louisville in 1970 and has spent most of his life here. He was in the bands Squirrelbait, Slint, The Breeders, and Evergreen, and is currently in a band called Water that released a record last year on the Temporary Residence label and has been touring the US and Europe. Britt's also currently a student here at U of L, studying for an undergraduate degree in the humanities, and he's the father of an amazing person named Evelyn Wofford. Okay, so I've got some questions about the scene, and my name is Cotton Seiler. I'm an associate professor of American Studies at Dickinson College. I'm also a Louisvillian, and the reason that I'm here today with these exceptionally talented people is because 20 years ago I was a student at the University of Kansas studying with Barry Shank, and the master's thesis project that I hit upon was to sort of slavishly replicate Barry's study of Austin, Texas, and to do an ethnography of a rock and roll scene. I immediately thought of Louisville being my hometown, and I had access to a number of people who were instrumental in the scene. And I came back and interviewed a lot of folks, including many of the folks on the panel here. And that master's thesis I finished in 1998, and then an abbreviated version of it was published in the Journal of Popular Music Studies in 2001. And so I'm very flattered to be here. I'm also a little embarrassed because it's in some way a piece of academic juvenilia for me. At the same time, I don't really know about the Louisville scene as it is today. So the past 20 years I'm not as well versed in. But the 70s, roughly through the 90s, was my object of study in this project. So for those of us who studied music scenes, including Holly Cruz and Barry Shank, one of the things that we always have to ask ourselves, what are the sites, what are the key sites of the scene, and who are the key figures? So I'm going to ask the panel to reflect on what were the places. Those of you who've seen the film Breadcrumb Trail might think of a place like Britt's basement, where so much happened, so much ferment in terms of the Slint composition. And thinking also about sites like venues, record stores. Who were the people that were there? Who were the sort of early nodes of the scene? So I'll throw that question out to the panelists.
I'll suggest one, the Taco Bell parking lot on Bardstown Road, 2 doors down from where Tooligan's Tavern was, because most of my friends who were interested in music weren't old enough to get into Tooligan's Tavern to see shows. So we generally listened to shows from behind Tooligan's, and then kibitzed and kept score and talked about the shows in the Taco Bell park.
Which is also notable as the final resting place of probably the most notorious punk house of the early scene. They knocked it down and put Taco Bell on top of it. So it's a hollow place.
Right, the ground was still vibrating.
I remember the Highland House, that would be one. And I'm trying to, I know Steve Good lived there, Big Martin lived there. Who else lived there? Fred?
I never really did.
Mine. Yeah, some people didn't know who lived there, but we all hung out there. But that was a scene for really great house shows and things like that. And so that would be one that I'd toss out there.
The 1069 was pretty cool. I went there a few times as a little kid, and it was like lots of holes in the walls, and like the central room was a practice room for the Babylon Dance Band, which was really intense because they like practiced notoriously like hours and hours and hours at a time. All those people were really nice.
And Britt, how old were you when you were visiting the 1069 Bardstown Road Punk House?
11.
Yeah.
Low.
11?
I'd say for me, the Hepburn House, Britt's basement, a lot of practice places, like Dave Pajo's basement, Cafe Dog for us, Tooligan's,
The Urban Alternative Homestead.
the Urban Alternative Homestead, yeah, Charlie's Pizzeria.
Where did Kid Lane? It's a little later.
Mm-hmm.
I think we have to stress too that this is pre-internet, and so if you wanted to get a hold of music, you actually had to go actively seek it out and get most often, it'd be a record or a cassette, sort of cassettes circulating around. I think there was was an early squirrel bait practice cassette that sort of changed hands and then got commentary on it. People would record over it, this sucks, or this is great, or something like that, and then would pass on. And so that became sort of part of the text of that sort of
And if you wanted to mingle with people, you had to go there.
There was an evergreen live show that people. There was an evergreen live show that people from my generation passed around a lot too. That was really great. I always loved that tape a lot. I was going to say more than the record that came out, but I think the record, I mean, it indicated the difference between live and studio recording, though. You know, loving that tape and driving around in my car and listening to it and feeling the energy of Evergreen, which was this amazing local band, obviously. But when the record came out, it didn't seem to have the same kind of energy that the tape had. You know, I mean, it's still a great record, and the songs are awesome, but it was an interesting contrast.
What about record stores?
Obviously, Ear Ecstasy.
I don't, you know, as a young teenager, felt a kind of adversarial relation to record stores. I think it was a generational thing. It always seemed like kind of older hippies who ran record stores, and it was great that they had a small punk section, or you know, stocked some strange records. But the relationship was usually defined by, I don't know, like people pasting flyers to the side of Pyramid Records, and Pyramid Records essentially offering a reward to bust the person who pasted the flyers, or painted the Hitler mustache on Paul McCartney. I mean, I was grateful for the record stores, and it was a place where I spent a lot of time, you know, with friends. But it wasn't until Ear Ecstasy that I felt any kind of like ability to have a conversation with people who ran the record store. So John Timmons, who ran Ear Ecstasy, I had known for his having played in Jill Thorpe and the Beat Boys. So that was the connection.
Well, I actually got my start in rock bands because I worked my way into the record department at Hollywood Booksellers in Shelbyville Road Plaza, which was the least punk area, I guess, of the city. But, you know, if you were sort of bookish and kind of nerdy, you went there, yeah. And the record department was cool because Tim Barnett ran it, and he, you know, selected what he wanted and imported that. That was a little bit later, that's mid-'80s, but that was my entree into actually being in a band, because I got to, you know, watch him order and help, you know, label cassettes of the new Smith EP or whatever was coming in. But, you know, that led to me getting in a band, so it was kind of punk record department.
Yeah, bookstores were hugely important. Twice Old Books,
Yeah.
the used bookstore on Bardstown Road, where I feel like Steve Driesler, that may have been the first place that I ever met you or saw you. And Harold Mayer, who ran it, was absolutely somebody who would press, you know, beat literature or, he was always pushing William S. Burroughs on teenagers.
I mean, Twice Told was certainly a place that many of us, as David suggested, found our way to literature outside the canon, you know, of high school and even you know, undergraduate college, you know, for some of us. And Harold, though pretty much exclusively interested in jazz personally, was a huge supporter, the proprietor of Twice Told, Harold Mayer, was a huge supporter of the efforts of all of us, and he made you feel like what you were doing wasn't a waste of time.
Yeah. But it was just such a random connection. I met Harold and first went into Twice Told. I remember walking into there with a laundry basket of, you know, Irma Bombeck paperbacks and things that my mother told me to find a used bookstore to sell. You know, if life's a bowl of cherries, what am I doing? Yeah. And I think he bought them all and then gave me a couple of William S. Burroughs and Hubert Selby books in return. It was a kind of community service.
Yeah.
I'm sure he just threw those books out.
My mom
Maybe
would have
here's
bought
a
those
reception
books.
reader.
And I'll throw out one other thing is outside of Louisville, there's in Washington. That's where I met Ken, that's what led to me putting out a King Kong Records. And that's sort of like a diaspora. I met Steve, and I got to know David Grubbs and Ken Kacken. A lot of people, even though it was Washington D.C., it was sort of like a Louisville hangout.
Right. Or Chicago very quickly became a Louisville hub for, I mean, I spent a lot of time with some of these folks in Chicago.
Yeah. Well, that's another question I'm thinking about, because as I left Louisville when I was 17, and I never really came back except to visit. And everywhere I went, people would talk about Louisville in sort of reverent, maybe slightly disparaging terms, as sort of a very strange place. And of course, that's the famous Hunter Thompson quote that opens the film Breadcrumb Trail, and actually is the epigram for my article as well, which is keep in mind, he's telling Ralph Steadman, the illustrator, he meets him at Churchill Downs for a 1970 piece in, I think, Stanley's magazine. And he meets Ralph Steadman, of course, a Brit, and he says to him, keep in mind for the next few days you're in Louisville, Kentucky, not New York, not London. This is a weird place. And everywhere I went, people would talk about Louisville. Where I was in Chicago, I was in San Francisco, or Lawrence, Kansas. People would talk about Louisville as having something odd about it. And I'm wondering if Louisville's position as a city, and it's a city that in the 19th century was very, very prominent, I think one of the most populous cities in the country, and then sort of in the 20th century, and especially in the post-war era, began to decline standard of living, things like that. So what was it about Louisville that sort of gives it this strange quiddity of weirdness? Is it the fact that it's sort of considered a backwater? Is it what is it? Is it a representative city of a lot of American cities in the late 20th century, or is it something all its own?
I mean, I think there's something to the conflicting roles of Louisville being the big dog in Kentucky and the underdog regionally or nationally. And so I think it's that friction. On the one hand, people from Louisville tend to feel and express a cultural superiority to the rest of the state of Kentucky. You know, whether that's earned or not, but particularly vis-a-vis Lexington. And yeah, we can talk about differences between Louisville and Lexington, but I think it's that kind of big dog quality within the state of Kentucky. And then once you get beyond the Commonwealth of Kentucky, people have a different view of Louisville, right? If they think of it at all. So when we were exchanging a couple of emails about this, and I was thinking of a few images. One was a photo that Joel Hunt took at the opening of the exhibition that Steve organized at KMAC. It's a photo of Brett Ralph, who couldn't be here tonight. He's a legendary local punk singer and then kind of outlaw country singer. I remember playing High Q against it, which was like a televised quiz show. And at halftime, each person has to introduce themselves in like one sentence. And I remember Brett saying, I'm Brett Ralph. I play football and write poetry. And just kind of like blaring at the camera. At the opening of this exhibition, Brett was wearing a sweatshirt that said Louisville versus everyone. And for me, that kind of encapsulated something of this attitude. And also, I've seen Breadcrumb Trail, Lance Fang's documentary about Slint, a couple of times, and the biggest laugh getter, and there are many laughs in it because you guys were incredibly hilarious. And still are pretty funny when you want to be. But this photo of various handmade posters that you guys would put in the back of your van, right? Slint leaving Louisville. There's one of like upraised middle finger, and it's something to the extent of where we come from, people are much friendlier. and that sort of that Louisville against everyone, but the insanity of not caring. Like I'll take anyone on. It seems very characteristic of the strangeness of Louisville.
Well, it's also just a very contradictory state, and as you say, our sort of position in the state is a little bit, tense. But the state, to this history of the state, I mean, from the get-go, it can't make up its mind what the agenda is for the state. Are we going to make our living selling pot, tobacco, horses, and bourbon, or are we going to keep shutting that down and make the rules against, all of that, and it's only about God, I think I just blew that out. But, it's just it's still just so not sure of itself. Like this morning, we're listening to this thing about Rand Paul, and we're like, is this really our home? I mean, is this guy, is he, obviously not representing us, but it's just a totally contradictory state. It's geographically, can't decide if it's north, south, or Midwest. I mean, I think a lot of that is just sort of in our culture really deep here. And so we don't know, what are we here? Still trying to figure that out.
I want to bring up something that came up in a panel yesterday. There were some people here that have organized festivals locally, the Outskirts Festival and the Cropped Out Festival. And it came out, we were kind of talking about Louisville and what is it about Louisville that, allows for this sort of specialness to happen. And part of it is that we kind of just have to make it happen ourselves. Like if you're in New York, all the stuff's happening. You can just go out and enjoy it. But here we have to create it ourselves. And maybe that's part of the reason.
I would completely agree with that. The recipe that I would give is attitude plus isolation. And I think particularly in the time frame that we're discussing with this panel, which is to say a pre-internet era, the fact that that information was hard to come by, that culture was hard to get, made it valuable in a way that is increasingly hard to remember. But I think I was talking to Ken Katkin on his great radio show out of Cincinnati, Trash Flow Radio, the other day about this, and I'm saying, you'd go into the record store and you might have $8, and that was all the money you were going to have for a really long time, and so you had to choose really carefully what record to buy, and there really wasn't much information to go on. There were some fanzines and stuff, both locally produced and nationally that found their way here, but you really just had to kind of make an educated guess, and sometimes you guessed horribly wrong. But when you got it right, you had a relationship with the object that wouldn't have existed otherwise, because it was almost like you found your way to each other through space. And as a consequence, because there wasn't a lot to listen to that you could get, people would come back from Washington, D.C. or Vancouver or New York with a couple of records or a couple of books, and it was like, this is the news of the world. And everybody would sort of trade those records and share them, or trade the books around. And I think people listened really closely to what they could get as a result of that, and sort of processed that and made of it what they would, and brought their own weird sensibilities, which definitely exist in Louisville. But I think that isolation had a lot to do with the distinctiveness of what the community ended up producing musically.
I just want to add, when we were writing the article that you mentioned, in my introduction, we interviewed Tara Key, who is one of the greats from the scene here, and she described getting the, Chip going to New York or whatever and bringing stuff back. She described it as fresh meat from the kill. It was like that intense.
Heather, you circulated something that Tara wrote for Luma that described, for example, when the band The Embarrassment from Lawrence, Kansas played at Tooligans, and for the Babylon Dance Band, it was like, it's like the search plane finding people on the island or something like that, like the ping from the far end of the universe that shows alien intelligence.
Yeah.
Right. I certainly don't want to suggest that this was unique to Louisville. I think that's actually part of what's interesting about it, is that this was happening in many communities across the country simultaneously. It's just that those communities were existing largely in isolation. A touring band would come through or something like that, and you realize there are other people out there, that feel like we do. And obviously there were urban centers like New York and Los Angeles that you would be sort of dimly aware of, but it's not even something that you could you know, unless your parents took you there on a trip or something, you weren't even really able to visit at that point, you know, because you were in high school. So it was a bit of a fantasy world in a way. I mean, they were only known through the primary documents of like the records and eventually touring bands, but in the early 80s, they weren't coming through Louisville.
Eventually, yeah. So I saw the exhibition at KMAC this morning, and one of the things that I was really struck by is it's organized chronologically, and about 2/3 of the way through the exhibition, you start seeing bands from out of town. But apart from that, it's just Louisville bands playing with Louisville bands and developing
Just making
somewhat
your
in
own fun.
isolation.
I mean, that was all there was to do. was
Making your own no fun.
Yeah, exactly.
But let me push it just a little bit, because you're right, there were these scenes everywhere, and there were certainly other kids who were isolated and interested in punk and interested in a broader culture, but you know, it's taking the name, there's a store here called Why Louisville, so that'll be my question. I mean, is there something particularly about Louisville, its Kentuckiness, its sort of quasi-southernness, its situation right on the Mason-Dixon line, its history as sort of a sin town for you know, tobacco and prostitution and gambling for people who work the Ohio River. Is there something in the history of the city that would lead us to this point, this particular sound, this particular confluence that we saw, you know, the last 2 decades of the 20th century?
I'm not sure that there is, honestly. I mean, you know, I don't know. I mean, but if you're asking me, I'm not sure that there is. I mean, I think in theory it could have happened anywhere geographically. I mean, those things are certainly factors. I mean, the things that Rachel spoke to, the sort of uncertainty about where we are. I mean, there's an expression about Louisville that it's the most northern southern city and the most southern northern city, and it does have a bit of a personality crisis in that regard at times, but and I don't mean to suggest that isn't a factor, that it isn't an influence, but I kind of think that it has to do with the people that were here and their influence of each other more than it had to do with geography. So, in theory, if those people were translated to some other city, if they had all grown up in Lawrence, Kansas, say, which had a really incredible scene in the early 80s itself, as has been referenced, but then, you know, then Louisville would have been Lawrence, or Lawrence would have been Louisville, or something like that, you know. But I mean, to me, it had to do with the people that grew up here in that time, and the creativity that they brought each individually, and you know, the community was the sum of those parts.
Yeah, you know, Louisville frequently represents itself in terms of those paradoxes, but most northern and southern city. Like, I remember growing up, my parents had a coffee table book of like photos of Louisville. That the introduction began, you know, with the thrift of the East, the hustle of the North, the optimism of the West, and the charm of the South. And it's impossible to combine those things. It's foolish.
Yeah,
You know,
I don't
it's
think
a pretty high standard.
Yeah, I don't think of Louisville as optimistic.
Well,
Yeah,
all those
but there's such high standards that it's okay to fail, which is very Louisville.
We're bound to fail.
Well, I guess I couldn't really live up to any of those.
It makes me wonder, though, because all of that, clearly that's what you're talking about, all of those things, that's a marketing document. And in some ways, the origin of Kentucky is a marketing document written by, I think, Henry Clay. It's sort of, come on, you Virginians, come into this new territory. So I wonder if there's still something about that sort of hucksterism that, you know, we see in sort of Louisville self-definition, but that it's situated on so many different fault lines.
Yeah, but maybe you can say that hucksterism is a thing that certain individuals, you know, thought hilarious and aimed to satirize through playing music.
Well, Louisville's also an old city and has a lot of old generations of families here, so it's a little bit like maybe like a European place. But there's like sort of old money from a long time ago, and they're generous with the arts and culture, whereas like a more kind of more commercialized type city, like an Atlanta or something, wouldn't have that kind of, wouldn't be established in the same way. It just sort of trickled down to the punk rock scene in the 80s from over the years before.
I think something that also that was very that is very concrete that you can point to about the Louisville of the 1970s or so that I grew up in was the fact that it was defined largely by the Louisville Courier Journal and Louisville Times, which were excellent family-owned newspapers, kind of on a par with the Des Moines Register or the Sacramento Bee or something like that. And given the region, very politically progressive, and I always think that that's one of the things that differentiates Louisville from other cities like Lexington,
Indianapolis.
Yeah.
Yeah, so in the,
I think the city politically owes an incredible amount to, the voice of that community.
We're like a big college town, like where people would come and then they'd go move on. They sort of stay here in Louisville.
yeah, it did seem like we inherited a lot of culture just from, I mean, at one point Louisville was a really, like, valued place to people are very popular because it was just such a nice place geographically and the climate, and so it seems like people like live
Sounds
here.
like you're pretty chick. And the weather's pretty good.
I mean, you know,
Rarely snows.
yeah, and a lot of people lived here, like wanted to live here who were maybe, I don't know, more progressive or something like that. And I feel like we inherited a lot of culture.
I wouldn't disagree with any of those things, but I do feel compelled to point out that like the newspaper of record could not care less about like the early efforts of this little music scene. I mean, it's a far cry from now, and people like Everly Puckett do a great job of supporting, writing about local bands. But in the era we're talking about, they didn't know and they didn't care.
Yeah.
So
Although, who needed
no credit.
newspapers because you had fanzines? Those were much more important.
Yes, although, I mean, originally there weren't many local fanzines, and they came out sporadically at best, so they weren't, a super reliable source of information. I mean, they were usually idiosyncratic in their reviews and that sort of thing. So I mean, they had the force of personality behind them. I mean, there were a lot of really charming things about the fanzines.
Yeah.
But they weren't necessarily like objective or
No, they weren't objective at all.
I mean, they weren't very useful guides in that way. I didn't find. I mean, it depends on who did. I mean, obviously your record reviews could always be trusted. But
Yeah, right. Yeah, and when I felt like I was taking too long to produce Hit the Trail, my little 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch, 8-inch page, it's like an 8.5 by 11 sheet that you fold over once, cut, and then insert. When that was taking me too long to produce, it was too slow, then I started stapling record reviews to telephone calls on Birdstown.
I like that idea. I'm sorry that didn't catch on.
Yeah.
I remember when you had your first band in the Courier Journal.
Uh-huh.
I could not believe that there would be such a band with such a name.
I'm talking about Happy Cadavers.
See?
You couldn't believe you hadn't thought of it.
I just couldn't believe that there was such a thing.
Yeah.
So you were scandalized by it.
Yeah, I thought it was outrageous.
Yeah. I don't know. I was at the KMAC exhibition and I thought, okay, well, you got your work cut out for you for follow-up exhibition, which is on fanzine culture in Louisville.
Remember Maximum Rock and Roll had a little page for every city. So it was almost never a Louisville page.
Yeah, actually. Well, it was actually.
You're still angry about it.
Yeah, but I mean, I think it was sort of a point of pride in a way.
Oh, yeah,
for us,
yeah.
Like at the time that.
Under the radar.
Yeah, somebody had to elect to write the scene report from the from the community that, Maximum Rock and Roll, which is a San Francisco-based fanzine and, extremely well distributed in the mid-'80s, the time period we're currently talking about. But somebody had to take it upon themselves to be the scene reporter for Louisville or Des Moines or Chicago. They didn't go out and solicit that. And it was sort of a point of pride for us, I think, you know, at least the people I knew, that none of us cared whether people in the Red Rock, Maximum Rock and Roll were up on what was happening in Louisville or not.
Well, because our mission
Fuck
was
them.
accomplished. We were playing music, we were listening to music. That's all it really mattered. I mean, you were in a band as a sort of vehicle for your own expression, but you were spending most of your time listening to your friends' band.
Right.
That was just what we did. And it's so difficult to really get that through to someone who is under 30, you know, because that's the only way we experienced it. It didn't happen at home unless you were listening to a record. There was no other way to experience this exchange except to go out and, you know, so you were playing it, you were listening to it, and that was all that we were trying, and we weren't trying to get out.
Yeah, I don't think we had any hope of that.
Maybe we were hoping
Yeah.
to get a single made or a record,
Yeah.
but that,
I remember going to Cincinnati and seeing the Dead Kennedys, and there's probably 1,000 people there, just huge. And then I come back to Louisville, and Dead Kennedys wouldn't even play in Louisville. You go see a band, and there'd be like 20 or 30 people there to see a local band.
So if you're thinking about that as Louisville as a place that was under the radar, in some ways, did that have a sustaining effect and a galvanizing
did,
effect?
yeah.
Like Ethan's still mad about Maximum Rock and Roll. The Louisville page.
Yeah.
But
Or there being more Dead Kennedys fans.
yeah.
Much more enlightened.
But
But I
that's-
say, well, at least we got better local. At least our local bands are better. You know?
But let's say Rolling Stone or Spin or something descended on Louisville, which of course later they did. Louisville, that media spotlight turned on Louisville, especially in terms of popular music. Would that have been something that would have been A, welcomed at the time? B, would they have gotten it right?
No. Well,
No.
it
I
started
remember
with Squirrel
Squirrel
Bait.
being called Outre Rock Warriors in Rolling Stone. That was really good.
It really started with Squirrel Bait.
Outre Rock Warriors.
That's when Spin
I had to
magazine
look up
started
Outre.
writing articles about Louisville and Squirrel Bait and stuff, and that's when it all started. People were very, very proud and excited about it, I thought.
But it was a shift, like, wait. what?
Yeah, that was the
Yeah.
beginning.
Yeah.
Well, I remember actually when the first Corvette record had come out while David and his bandmate Cliff Johnson were freshmen in college, and then I guess you played a show. I mean, before that, you couldn't even get a show like at Tooligans.
Yeah.
You know, you were essentially banned from
Yeah.
Tooligans, but.
For sneaking in and getting kicked out.
Yeah, but once the record was out, and it was getting pretty laudatory national
Tooligans
press.
was willing to make amends.
Exactly. There was a show over
Over
Christmas
Lord.
break that you played that Christmas break, and
Yeah.
there was something like 300 kids that came out, and I just remember thinking, like, where the fuck did all these kids come from? Like, it was amazing because it went from like 30 people to 300 like that, and then the all ages shows that came in the years to come, made that seem like nothing. But there was just this sudden jump, as Rachel suggests, and to me it happened at that show.
Yeah.
Actually, now I
For me.
remember holding the LP
Mhm.
at Holly Cook and like turning it over and going like, trying to figure it out.
Right.
How does this
Brownsboro
work?
Road.
Whoa. and thinking, this is like kind of a new. I mean, it was new for me.
Mhm.
I don't know. Maybe it was parallel. It was sort of new for a lot of people.
No,
the
it was,
idea that
yeah.
wait,
Just
these really nice records, town record.
Yeah.
Just to get back to something Ethan mentioned about, I think he said Louisville in some ways is a little bit like Europe, like a European place. There's maybe old money, and how did the early punk scene and then sort of the hardcore and indie scene that came out of that, how did it sort of abide by Louisville's sort of separations and segregations, maybe by class and by race and things like that? How did it abide by them, and how did it transgress them? What were some of the ways in which, one of the exciting things about any scene is how it sort of generates a different type of community than other institutions would generate. How did that happen here, and what were some of the key moments in that?
Louisville's a profoundly segregated city. I mean, I'm looking out, and I know a lot of people here are from Louisville, so this isn't news to everyone. But the South End is primarily working class white. West End is primarily African American, East End is primarily middle and upper middle class white. And the punk scene in Louisville for me was the way to make friendships and relationships with people who grew up in the South End who otherwise I would have had no contact with except for through Haiku, this television quiz show. And still extremely racially segregated. I mean, it was amazing last night going to the New Vintage, which is formerly Uncle Pleasant's, and seeing 1200 play, which is the first time that I've seen anything even related to hip hop or coming out of the West End of Louisville there. So yeah, I mean, it's an extremely racially and economically segregated city.
That is true, without question. But one thing that I was struck by a couple of years ago, some photos of Louisville's first punk band, which was called No Fun, surfaced playing at the old Galt House, which is right Main Street, just a few blocks from
the
I think,
Center.
yeah, well, from the Center, but from where many of you are staying, right there at 2nd and Main. And there's photos from a show that they were playing in that building, and I mean, it looked like a great time, but what I was really struck by was how diverse the audience was at that point. And I had got a chance to say something to Tony Pinotti, who was one of the members of the band at the opening reception for the exhibit at Museum of Art and Craft. We were talking about that, and he was just kind of talking about how many of the people in those early bands, I mean, they came out of art school, but they were living downtown, which was essentially a ghost town at that point, and they were going to gay clubs because that was about the only type of thing down there. But he said that's the kind of music we were listening to anyway, so we would go there and dance, and like we just sort of like became friends with them. They would come to our shows, and it was kind of, there was like this easy flow back and forth. Like there wasn't a real sense of boundaries in the early days of like between like the gay club scene and like the occasional punk rock show, and it was just amazing, because I was looking at like, there are black people in the audience, like this is so great, like, and there certainly were, like to a certain extent later, but I mean not in the same sort of numbers that proportionally represented like in this photos, and that's really too bad.
Yeah.
Well, like 60s rock and roll sort of started the, black and whites playing music together, listening to similar types of music, and then when you got rap is very similar to punk. It's kind of like the African American version of punk, if you ask me. It has the same kind of attitude and the same the local scene. It was like
And a sense of do it yourself. You could
do
just
it yourself.
Do it yourself with no real means.
Make your own,
Fun.
make your stuff on a sheet.
What about, one of the striking things about the Louisville indie scene is the prominence of women in it that you didn't necessarily see in other punk scenes. And Heather mentioned Tara Key, and there's a number of other women who were instrumental. They were band leaders, they were band members. How did, again, sort of what was it about the Louisville scene that maybe was more conducive to more egalitarian and gender politics in it?
You don't think it's like that everywhere? No.
No.
There used to be a band that was almost always just guys. And in the 90s, girls started being in bands more.
I mean, there were some early examples. I mean, Tara Key certainly being,
In the School of
I
Art
think
in
that's
general.
yeah.
Not
But that's what I was
right?
gonna say. Yeah,
Catherine?
yeah. I think, yeah. The fact that like a lot of the early bands came out of, were formed by people who met in art school probably helped this. But yeah, actually, a lot of the early bands did have women in them. I mean, the Dick Brains had 2 women in the band, to 3 men, and as Heather said, Janet Bean was in several of the early bands here before they came to Chicago, and but then by the mid '80s, for a time, I mean, I think a lot of that had to do with like the sort of aggro, like.
The hardcore punk
Like,
was a much more
yeah, so it's like
masculine
almost all
scene,
dudes,
no question about it.
almost all dudes, and
No question.
that's kind of what David and Ethan and Britt and I sort of came up in initially. But so for a time, it did. I mean, it was like so hard to get any girls to come to the shows. It seemed like,
Right.
Which was a real goal.
Right. Which is why, as a musician in Louisville, just a few years younger than somebody like Tara Kate, it was incredible seeing the Babylon Dance Band and seeing this woman totally fucking shred on the guitar.
Absolutely. I mean,
It
and
really
so
is like
in a sense, it was just
skill
like, of course. I mean, of course, you know, the woman can be like the guitar player. Like we've got one. She can kick everybody
She's
else's
the
ass.
best.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Especially in the early biological years, the guys and the girls sort of stayed separate. When you're 15, it's, you know, you don't have to, like,
No, I know what you
you're not comfortable
mean.
having girls
Yeah.
hang around. I don't know, that's.
Well, it was still quite an oddity, I have to say, you know, sneaking into Julian's at 15, 16.
Yeah.
There were a lot of women there to hear, like, you know, Lead Pelvis and Fancy Pants and whoever was playing. But there weren't that many women in bands. And being the girl in a band was really an odd thing for a while. And, you know, I think it does have something to do with the development of a more solidly defined hardcore scene.
Yeah.
But my band was Lemonade Hayride or Hulu was never considered hardcore or more like twee pop, you know, so that seemed to be kind of maybe an allowance for me being in a band. I don't know that I would have been taken seriously if I'd been trying to teach myself how to play bass guitar in a hardcore band. Maybe it would work, but
Right.
But you could have learned it in about
there's a
5
little more
minutes.
flexibility.
It would have been a great time investment.
So many of
There's
you as
flexibility, I
musicians,
guess.
you moved away from that hardcore aesthetic pretty quickly. And what was it? What made you make those transitions and those sort of new innovations in terms of genre?
Because we didn't allow each other to be lunkheads, I think.
Just the idea of something different. I mean, you knew that. I mean, why keep making the same music? I mean, why you want whatever you're bringing to be different from what your friends have been doing, and so that idea of variety to me is just so appealing, especially because you know this is your scene, right? You're going to hear each other's music. It might as well be different.
For a long time, I'm sorry to cut you off there, but for a long time, to me at least, the defining characteristic, I would say that the defining characteristic of the little music community in that era that we're talking about is that no two bands sounded the same,
Yeah.
and I think that was not an accident. I mean, I think it was
a
a matter of
goal.
choice. Yeah, exactly. It was a goal. Well said.
Yeah, I just felt like of my kind of tightest circle of friends who were musicians or around music, all, I don't know, sort of like held each other to high standards. I don't know. Britt, you in particular, I think like had almost the sharpest edge of anybody. Of just like, you know, if you thought that something wasn't, I mean, you could read it in your face like I'm reading it in your face right now. You know, that if you just thought something wasn't cutting it, it was just like, oh man. You and Brian McMahon and Ned Oldham and Will Oldham. Yeah.
Well, and also-
I felt like people held each other to high standards.
But also then there's the opposite of that. My band, which was maybe not held to a high standard, but people would always come to our shows. I mean, when we formed our band, we couldn't play instruments,
Yeah.
so we're the sort of opposite of that virtuosic. And I think just sort of that desire to just get out there and do something and have a good time was enough also for some people, you know?
Yeah.
So
Yeah, you never.
that is, yeah.
I mean, you may not have known how to play, but you never liked charm.
Like I do.
People always love Lucky.
Right. Yeah. And then we would just invite everybody to be in the band. That, you know, that helped.
Yeah, and I found that by the time I was 18, I found that I could only take so much hardcore. There's so many hardcore bands.
Yeah.
There's
And-
only so much I could take.
Yeah, I mean. Yeah, I mean, once you've heard the Bad Brains, I mean, where are you gonna go from there?
Well, I think now that we're sort of looking back on this, and this is a moment that's been recognized by journalists, academics, fans, and musicians as a time and a group of people who have this tremendous ferment in Louisville. And so now, in some ways, the orbit has shifted. They've talked about Chicago being a site of where a lot of Louisville musicians hung out and mixed with other musicians. And I think it was referred to at one point sort of Louisville North. They call Chicago, Louisville North, because there was such a tremendous amount of influence there. But, and I think this is something from someone who left Louisville at 17 and hasn't really ever lived here since, is the massive transformation in Louisville in the last 20 years. Is there some relationship between this sort of renaissance of Louisville from about 2000 forward and the renown, sort of the cultural renown that Louisville has generated since then?
Yeah, just like she was saying, when she went to see Squirrel Bait and suddenly there are 300 kids there. I'm like, who are all these people? And then it just keeps going every couple of years.
Self-awareness just grew, possibly just also with technology. All of us, whatever, expanding and going out into the world, I don't know. It's sort of parallel to the expanded general awareness of what's going on. Not through such narrow channels of one or two British magazines and, it just, general everything. And I think that outside parties brought awareness that sort of made people maybe a little recalibrate, oh, is this how it is?
That's what became
So being told this is how it is sort of a strange experience.
It became more institutionalized. And there are also a lot more young people now than there were when we were young. There's just a larger generation. But,
Apparently Louisville's the number 2 city in terms of attracting millennials with college degrees. Or no, the number 1.
Yeah, I think.
What?
Portland, Oregon is number 2. Well, apparently it's because it has Southern charm, and Western Canyon. But no, it's true. And also you see it in this. I mean, I think when I moved away from Louisville, there was one restaurant here, like Casa Grisanti, was the restaurant you went to, and now it's just exploded with the cultural scene, with the music and art and food and booze. It's a city that's a real destination now, in a way that it wasn't at the time when all this was going on. And I wonder how much, if we're getting back to marketing a city, and the Louisville scene, especially of these years, seems to be something that people point to as sort of emblematic of Louisville's coolness.
What, something that happened in the past?
Yeah.
Plus the mayors, Jerry Abramson and then the mayor we got now.
Not the mayor anymore.
You said the mayors.
They've been encouraging hipsterism in Louisville a lot for years. They're really pushing it.
Are you part of the campaign, Ethan?
Ethan's
Ethan
Louisville.
lives here.
Ethan's Louisville.
Ethan's
Not even a flag.
With the Daniel Boone cap. Come on.
Ethan sleeps here.
I mean, this is an old story. It's not unique to Louisville. I mean, it is true. It's what cities, in my thinking, always do. Do their best to block creativity in a community and then celebrate it once it's gone.
Quarter century later.
Yeah, exactly.
But to some degree, a lot of our friends we're now all getting to a point where we can start our own businesses, our own amazing, beer establishments, our own amazing restaurants. We're working for universities now. Just the fact that a lot of this age group is now able to kind of manifest their values in businesses, and a lot of us have stayed here, So maybe that's one reason some of it's more visible now. Not many of us are even trying to think about running a rock menu, but all the
Panel
tangential
discussions at universities.
Yeah, we're
We won.
Levers of power now.
In 1985, I imagined that in the basement of the library at U of L.
Well,
I can die happy.
And that's maybe, so maybe one more question before we throw it open to the audience, but in thinking about sort of where our generation is now in terms of, Ethan just said, it's become an institution, and as we have sort of insinuated ourselves into these institutional spaces, and now we have things like Luma, is this simply just another generation telling its own sort of, and heroizing its own story? I mean, is that,
Is it?
what is this archival impulse?
Yeah, well, of course. Every generation does that.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think that clearly we've sort of touched on this. I mean, what happened in Louisville in the 70s and 80s, you know, the pre-internet age is something that it no longer exists, obviously, but it is worth documenting, you know? I mean, even kids now. I mean, I was just thinking this morning about how I think people now who like don't even ever use a pencil. You know what I mean? Like they don't have to write things down, and so, you know, I mean, just from a generally historical perspective of what life was like, it's important. And then clearly, the music is part of that. The culture is part of that. I mean, I think it's important is what I'm trying to say. I also am interested in talking to the people that are attending the conference, you know, people who are interested in maybe doing research into archives like we have and learning more about the kinds of materials that academics find important. And, you know, that'll help inform how we collect, et cetera, et cetera. So I know there are a number of archives across the United States that are being started. Music archives, there's a really great one that at UMass Boston that is a hip hop archive that just went up online. A guy I went to college with is starting that. I don't know if that answers the question. That's not an answer.
I'm always interested in the way that archives can and sometimes can and cannot spark a kind of creative relay in making new work. But I think that the danger always for somebody who, you know, identifies themselves throughout their life through something that they did as a teenager, or, you know, and people growing up playing rock music or punk. I mean, this is a real danger, you know, that so much of your life is spent in retrospect thinking about these incredible things that you did when you were 15 years old. But I'm kind of interested in the way that archives lead to, you know, subsequent work, right, that continue creativity.
Right.
As opposed to just reifying a story and this is how it was and really not sparking any sort of creative response.
I'm delighted in the archivization of the punk era, which, you know, that was my adolescence and early adulthood. But I always do have a slight, internal resistance to, you know, hoping that people continue, you know, beyond this work that they made, you know, as really young people.
Right.
Yeah.
But that's just, you know, I mean, only the individual can.
Yeah, absolutely. That's not your job as an archivist. Come on, make some new things. Yeah, no, that's not your responsibility at all.
No, that's what happens to everything. Over time, it gets more institutionalized, and then there starts to be gatekeepers and people that want to keep it the same.
Are you calling Heather a gatekeeper?
No. But I'm just saying that, you know, we all know that. It's like.
But you know, at the same time, we've done events in the community where we go to this. There's a flea market that happens once a month, and we go there and tell people we're coming there, and we can collect materials. But then, you know, just all kinds of young people come up, and you know, they've heard the stories, and they're super excited to get to, you know, touch the materials. And I think it does inspire them. You know, I think there is an inspirational component to the youth of today.
Yeah. No, I'm much less inclined to think of a project like the one that you do as a gatekeeper thing, and I guess I thought more of like, you know, newspapers and media like that, and more as gatekeepers when I was growing up and making stuff. I mean, I see like a generosity of spirit in Luma and in the exhibition.
Or look at New Orleans. New Orleans was an isolated little place. And they had this real unique music scene, and they kind of stayed the same for a long time, and then it inspired all kinds of rock and roll stuff.
Yeah.
I'm gonna make an argument in defense of gatekeepers, because I think, Dave, what you were just pointing out in terms of Brit not liking something, and you could read it on his face. That's a gatekeeping function as well. There were, and of course you think of a label like Drag City or Quarterstick or something like that, all of those are in fact gatekeeping functions and able to sort of consecrate, this is important, this is worth documenting literally, and this other stuff isn't. So part of that deliberative and distinctive faculty is essential to the creating of something that's important.
Yeah, anything in the chain is potential gatekeeping.
And yet, I mean, independent labels are a kind of, I was going to say, inexhaustible resource. That's not quite the appropriate analogy. But, you know, I don't know. I don't see Drag City as a gatekeeper, because if Drag City didn't opt to put out your record, then there are hundreds or thousands of other labels that might, you know, where you could start your own. It doesn't, gatekeeping suggests that there's only, you know, one ingress and one egress, and, you know, a bottleneck. And releasing records is anything but a bottleneck.
I will say though, there's a subjectivity to labels, and labels have a particular identity. Drag City has an identity, and it's not necessarily based on the particular sonic aesthetics of the different bands it puts out, but it has a subjectivity in terms of what it finds important. It's idiosyncratic,
Yeah.
but that also becomes important to people who like Drag City, and if Drag City puts a band out, they're going to be relatively assured that it would be something that we still find interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, you're right that there's a variety of places, but it's a filter, or sort of, it's maybe a curation more than a gatekeeping.
Mm-hmm.
But I thought maybe we throw it open to the audience. I know people have questions, and I wonder if we should pass the mic out so I think they can get on.
I think that was working. You can try. Is it?
Yeah,
Use
maybe something in
Is that
the
there?
magnetic field.
Just put it.
So if you have a question, raise your hand.
You point, I'll run.
I want to speak to the idea of this archive being a function of self-aggrandizing, looking back at things that people did when they were 15 and celebrating it. I am not a Louisville native. I've been here only 4 years, but I'm one of the archivists working on the Luma project. And when I moved here, I had no idea that a large number of my favorite bands when I was in college were from Louisville. And when I found that out, I think that speaks to CD culture and not really reading the back. where these bands were from, but
There is no back anymore.
there's no back. No, it's too small to read. And really just wanting to know, who are these people? Why Louisville? You know, what was it about this city? And I wanted to know the story, and so I wanted to be a part of this Luma project to keep that story going, to make sure it was preserved. And we're creating a research collection, and I want to be clear that there is no gatekeeping. The only gatekeeping we do is to make sure that the materials last for many future generations to research and learn from, and then thereby create new things from. So I just wanted to say that.
You guys talked about some of the institutions like record stores, and I was wondering if there was any sort of college radio scene in the 80s.
No.
There was a short-lived only on-campus movement, but it was,
Just available through the
Sure.
shores, I think,
Yeah.
No, we really didn't have any access to radio.
It was one of those things that you didn't miss until you knew that you were missing it.
Yeah.
And for me, going to other cities and seeing how important college radio was, it was, yeah.
It was word of mouth.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, guys. I wanted to talk a little bit more about the generic diversity that came after this hardcore moment, and just to say, like, as a non-musician fan, friend of, whatever, that moment was super important to me. And I think also kind of, like, when I talk about the Louisville music scene, I still call it like punk rock, even though what most people were playing, you know, and for the last, like, you know, yeah. And so I guess I sort of would like you guys to maybe talk about, like, why I still want to call it that, or you want to call it that, because, or like how that hardcore moment was influential in the work that some of you guys have continued to do. And you know, a lot of the stuff that like is in the mass media about punk rock, like DIY or whatever, is so doesn't describe my experience of what that music was like, and it is about that super exacting kind of quality of that work, which at that point seemed to be about like intensity or judgment, but also just like technical skills playing and stuff. So I guess just like the punk, that sort of hardcore moment, and how it maybe you see that as like affecting the kind of work that you guys and other people in the scene have done afterward.
I mean, for me, punk is really the operative category because that was the authorizing moment, you know, that authorized me to form a band and to write music. In the same way that I played on and off with this group called the Red Crayola that started in Houston in 1966, and it's frequently described as a psychedelic group, even though it hasn't sounded like a psychedelic group since 1969. But psychedelia was really also the authorizing moment that made it possible for the Red Crayola to do what they did.
I've wondered about that myself a lot, because my neighbor said, her daughter said about Slint, like, well, Mom, that's not punk. And I was like, you know, so I wonder, but to me, punk was like, my experience of it here in Louisville was just like, you do something like from inside of yourself. Like that was kind of the main like, thing about it. So, and there was a lot of diversity, and that was really exciting because it was like, well, it could, you know, it's whatever is inside you, you know, like, so it could be different, but it was like honest or something.
I think one other way to describe that authorizing impulse is the sense that like previous standards don't apply. You know, that to me that was the significance of that moment that I understood as punk. It's like, well, all of these yardsticks that you used to rate rock music before this, it's really not applicable.
I think of, the words I think of are like freedom and excitement, you know. I came a little bit after, you know, I wasn't around during the 80s. I came in like in the early 90s, but, you know, has definitely, in my experience, always been this spirit of freedom and community and, you know, excitement and striving for that is punk, or our version of punk maybe, you know.
It's more intense, more ironic, more exciting, more angry.
But not mean. I mean, I guess there's some meanness, but in my experience, it's not meanness.
Well, shocking and
Yeah.
And the kind of people that say that I would hang around with in grade school and had nothing, didn't want to have anything to do with this other kind of music. So it kind of gave me an opportunity to find myself from them.
Mm.
But you had asked specifically about hardcore. I mean, I don't know if that was something you were particularly interested in.
You know, I was like 11, 12 when I first heard that music, and I kind of heard it in the company of people who were like listening more carefully than I still even can. I mean, you know, being around very, very intense music nerds was like a really powerful experience for me,
And that was the music. It was sort of the shock of trying to listen to something that I had no tools to listen to with people who were going to go in completely different directions. I think kind of sparked by that moment. So that's just a really interesting time, I think. And you guys were kind of like, oh, hardcore, blowing it off, but it was really, really important when it happened.
At this point, maybe a little bit, but I mean, in a sense. But I mean, I'm of the right age that my real throughway like into punk rock was with hardcore. You know, I mean, I started high school in 1981, and that was like, you know, the era of hardcore ascendancy, essentially. You know, I would say, I mean, personally, like 81 through maybe like 85. I know other people would extend that, but and that's though other bands were around, and I was hearing them simultaneously, and like what was being, you know, sort of lashed together under the invented title New Wave was everywhere. This is like the beginning of MTV, and all of these things were happening concurrently, and I was listening to all of them concurrently. Hardcore was like the first place where I felt that I found a home, a community, and we were just starting to be able to manage to have all ages shows around like 1982, 83. I mean, occasionally these venues would open up on a Sunday afternoon or something and let us come in, you know, for an all ages show, and there were bands that identified, sort of self-identified with the hardcore movement locally. If, you know, sonically they were more diverse than that might suggest, and it was great fun, I think. At the time, ultimately I started to feel that though hardcore was one natural evolution out of, you know, the punk explosion of like 1976, you know, onward, it was, I mean, it was true to punk in the sense that it adopted and seemed to understand like the tenet that like you didn't necessarily need to know what you were doing to do it, to start, and you know, it was a way to channel aggression and make your own fun, and those were all great things about it. But ultimately, or rather I should say, like really quickly, it seemed to me it got really codified, and like people would like, you know, say, you know, just like, you know, stand there like, you know, giving double barrels to a band, you know, because they weren't like just playing thrash or something, you know, and like people were really, it seemed increasingly like closed-minded about like what fit and what was appropriate. And then if you go back just a few years earlier, like 1979 and 1980, like things were just like so wide open, like anything counted as punk at that point. And suddenly like it had to be this one thing that was in a lot of ways like misogynist and
real white.
You very, I mean, no, it was. I mean, it really was. That's absolutely true. And just kind of closed-minded in some ways, and increasingly it seemed like the music, with some notable exceptions, was reflecting that sort of homogenization. And so that's why, I mean, personally, I sort of gravitated to other things. But I mean, it was an incredibly formative type of music for me, and I don't mean to diss it. You know, I mean, I wasn't kidding about Bad Brains. I mean, they're like one of the greatest bands of all time, in my opinion. But you know, it's not. It's music that I felt I grew out of.
But Steve, what you're talking about is sort of an ethical choice to move away from hardcore. That there's a politics.
I wouldn't have called it an ethical choice at the time. I mean, in retrospect, I mean, I would maybe agree.
But do you think also for the musicians, do you think it was also a technical and aesthetic one? That music simply was just so rudimentary that, especially as you progress and get better at your instrument, you want to make music that's more complex.
Yeah, I mean, somebody like Rich to answer this, not me. I mean, I'm you know, the one non-musician sitting up here, but yeah, I do think so, personally.
Yeah, it seems like you kind of get tired. You know, it was a pretty simple and kind of homogeneous form of music.
Could you talk about, is it on? Turn it off. No, I can get loud.
I can hear.
Okay. Could you talk about the relationship between like community ordinances and the scene? You're talking about putting flyers on utility poles. Like, I see utility poles covered in staples and there's nothing up. You put it up and they're gone the next day. You talk about venues and all age shows. Like, where do people go to play now? Were there more venues when you all were starting this, creating, were people playing house shows? Like, what's the relationship between the rules we put on things and how you're able to get what you're doing now?
Well, as far as the flyers go, there has been a change in in the city's tolerance for the flyering, and it's not. I mean, it was never permitted, but it's no longer tolerated on the poles. And as you say, if you put the flyers up on the poles, they will be very quickly removed. And people still make flyers, and you can find them in record stores and coffee shops and things like that. But obviously, with the rise of the internet, it no longer was the most effective way to get the word out, and so it plays a diminished role now, but people do still make flyers. And in the time period we're talking about, pre-internet, it was sort of the social media of its day. It was the way to get the word out. Even though most of the people that you could count on showing up, to a show already knew about, but you could still put the flyers up and hope against
every telephone.
Yeah, like in the hope that somebody that you didn't already know might see and be interested in coming.
There used to be an old lady that walked around tearing down all the flyers every morning too.
Yeah, I have a friend who can recall like putting the flyers up and seeing like the old guy coming down the street behind her, like ripping them down like a few poles back. So I mean, it was always, people were always tearing the flyers off and everything. But about the venues, I mean, there were, if anything, I would say that there were more places to play. I mean, it was always a struggle, but particularly in the earliest days, to find somewhere that would let you play. And typically, what bands like the No Fun and Battle Dance Band did, but they would just go to these kind of like old man bars, like in other neighborhoods. Like there's a neighborhood in the West End called Portland, and they would just find a bar down there and like walk in and say like, "Hey, we got a band, can we play?" And like the proprietor would agree. And like Tony Pinotti told me the other night, there's a bar just down the street from the New Vintage where some of you probably were last night on Preston Street, near here, called Zanzibar, which is open currently and was open back then. It was closed just in between, but. Bands like No Fun and Battle Dance Band played there in the late 70s, and Tony Pinotti from No Fun was telling me the other night that when they played the Zanzibar for the first time, they play a set and then take a break and play the same songs over again as the second set. And in between, after the first set, he said that the bartender told him like, "Hey man, you guys got to turn down. I can't even hit a cash register." So they would be able to get these one-off shows typically, but like then they would never be invited back. So it was always a struggle. And like bars like Tooligans were there, but in the early '80s, we're definitely not interested in having punk shows until it became something they could make money off of. And then they started having these really big all-ages shows. There were house parties, but in the earlier days, it was more like people coming over to watch a band practice, and maybe bring a 6-pack of beer or like a 22 of beer or something like that. They weren't really parties per se, so much as just like there's nothing else to do. Like let's go watch our friends practice.
Right. It's funny thinking of there being strictures or ordinances against flyers, because that would have never occurred to me. For me, the real dividing line was between flyers and graffiti. And everyone made flyers, and graffiti could be really shocking. And I remember Circle X graffiti, and I also remember riding with my parents to church one Sunday morning and seeing the fresh graffiti on the bridge next to Big Rock, "Eat your food or eat shit," and just being like, oh, my eyes popping out of my head. It's like the most shocking thing I ever saw in my childhood. Oh my God.
Well, it serves you right for shocking Ethan, so it's the name of your band.
Yeah.
I can
Happy Cadavers
for,
or eat shit.
as far as there were probably fewer venues, like legit venues from when I was going, but I don't know, whether it was just enforcement in general was way more lax. So you could get into clubs way easier when you were underage. And I don't remember, just sitting here trying to think, was it sort of standard policy that you could get into those places at 18? Even though drinking was still 21, or was it just that lax that I went to bars for 6 years before I could actually?
I think it was easier if you were a girl. I was talking to Chris Thompson about this the other day, who works at KVAC now. We went to high school together, but I mean, I do think, I didn't have as much facility as you apparently did, but I do agree that it was easier. It was
the drinking age did used to be 18, not too long before we turned 18.
Yeah.
So I think there was a period where it was still kind of, it wasn't real strict. And when they started cracking down on drunk driving and that kind of stuff in the later 80s.
Well, the back door at Tooligans was right by the stage, and there was no, there was no security, so all you had to do was open it and let your friends in.
Sneak on in.
And it was generally nice and loud in the parking lot. I heard some amazing shows.
Yeah, yeah. We heard many of the best shows from the parking lot.
And then, a lot of us started playing at high schools.
So when you
Yeah,
talk
yeah,
about,
that's important.
sorry, so when
Yeah,
you talk about all age venues, like you're not playing all age shows at bars, right? Or were you?
You mean at that time?
Yeah.
Community centers and high schools.
Yeah.
Sometimes they would have like a Sunday show.
Yeah, on Sunday, they would, the bar, I guess they weren't allowed to sell
'Cause they couldn't sell
alcohol
whiskey.
anyway, or maybe they would be allowed to sell beer.
Or you do it earlier in the day in order to have the space, and then they could kick everybody out by 8.
I mean, there's some pretty crazy laws under books about it around here. But so yeah, they would have these. They couldn't really sell liquor on Sunday anyway, so they would turn the bar, open the bar to the kids or something. But they were not typically all age shows.
I think we have time for one more question.
Yeah, I was, as someone who's an outsider who didn't grow up in Louisville, when I moved here, I'm so interested in how, even in the digital age, Louisville remains kind of, if you can think of a city as isolated in the digital era. I mean, I understand from your points of view, the city
Hard to
changed
think of a city as
dramatically.
isolated.
Yeah.
But like, that stat about the young people attracting millennials, the mistaken thing there is that the folks moving to Portland are from elsewhere. The people coming to Louisville are coming back from college, like many of them. So Louisville has young people, and they're keeping young people, but in terms of migratory patterns, we have the fewest people in and the fewest people out of any of the nearby cities, Cincinnati, Nashville, Indianapolis. And so it's this weird, again, as an outsider, there's this weird Louisville-ness that, I lived in Raleigh for 2 years and felt relatively in Raleigh, and I lived in Austin for 7 years and felt really quickly a part of Austin. But there's something about Louisville that there's still an inside-outside here that I think marks it as an old city. I think you can talk about it as an old city. And if you compare it even to nearby cities, I'm wondering how that might affect music production even today. I mean, even in the sort of digital era, there's this. And again, I'm speaking as someone not from here.
Can I jump in just real quick? I want to add to Kyle's question too. I think this is fascinating because I feel this as well. And I was born in Louisville, right? But I didn't grow up here, right? And so there's a sense in which like Louisville almost acted sort of discursively for those of us who like grew up in kind of central or rural Kentucky. It became this kind of window of knowledge and information, but nothing you could actually ever really be a part of in that way. And so you do still feel that tension, and I think it would be interesting to see what you guys have to say about that.
My heart goes out to people who move to Louisville and try to crack the code of the various aristocracies of Louisville.
My parents moved here in '68, and they said it took 30 years before they felt like they belonged here.
But that's a great point. That is an observation.
But I think the statistic that you're citing about that it's not millennials from other places, it's actually sort of Kentucky and maybe Kentuckiana people sort of. I think that's still pretty. That's a pretty estimable achievement for Louisville, given the fact that the expectation when we were kids was that you got the hell out of here. You weren't supposed to stay, especially if you were sort of entering into or being trained to enter into the professional managerial class. You got out of Louisville.
True, but it creates but those kids know where the old Sears was, kind of thing, right? So there's a limit, a built-in kind of unspoken sometimes limitations, or this is done here, this is not done here, and rather as opposed to someone sort of coming with a blank slate saying, why the hell not live in Portland or the West End or the South End, or whatever? Who cares, right? Well, Louisville, the East Enders may not come see you, the South Enders may not come see you, the West Enders may not come see you, right? And so some of those things, I'm wondering if that impacts the city even today. I mean, as more open as it is now.
No, I think it does.
It's far more outgoing place than it used to be.
Yeah.
There's no comparison.
But it is hidebound in a lot of ways. I mean, it is a city of tradition, I think, you know, or just habit, maybe even more than tradition.
It's a strength and a weakness, I think.
I would agree.
We need to wrap up.
It's a paradox of
We've got to the bottom of it. We've solved all the mysteries. I'd like to thank Heather Fox, Stephen Kiesler, Lisa Butler,